Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast with author and speaker David Cooks is brought to you by Compassion International. We've been a part of Compassion now for 6 months, been working with them, partnering with them here on the podcast, and they do great work. And I can't encourage you more to go to compassion.com/sportspectrum. This is your chance to see the kids in need across the world. Your chance to make a difference in a child's life. My wife and my daughter and myself, the Romanos, we sponsor a 13-year-old boy from Haiti. And we are just so thankful and grateful to be able to make a difference in that young boy's life. And you can make that difference as well. Compassion.com/sportspectrum. Every child being discipled in the Word of God. Over 150,000 children choosing to follow Christ in the last year alone by you providing these children with the basic necessities of life. Food, educational training, vocational training for the future, an impact on their lives like no other. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum for $38. Man, I promise you, you won't regret it. Make a difference in a child's life. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum and sponsor a child today. David Cooks is our guest today on the Sports Spectrum podcast. His new book is titled Getting Undressed: From Paralysis to Purpose. At the age of 15, David Cooks was in high school, a basketball player, someone who loves sports, and then suddenly his life changed forever. And he experienced a spinal aneurysm, leaving him a T6 paraplegic. Mike Krzyzewski, yes, that Mike Krzyzewski, Coach K of Duke University, endorsed David's book and says, David's journey from the playgrounds to Cameron Indoor Stadium and beyond is captivating and provides a framework to find a new perspective and to build a life filled with passion and purpose. David spent 25 years in education, including 17 years teaching at his alma mater, Marquette University High School in Milwaukee. And he also worked with Duke during his time in grad school. And that's how he met Coach K and got to form a relationship with him. And listen, the time that he was with Duke, from 92 to 94, Duke won 2 national championships. Now, this obviously isn't David taking all the credit for that, but just being around a team and an organization that's winning like that in the prime of what many think was Coach K's coaching career is pretty cool. And so David on this podcast shares his story of persevering and overcoming disability and overcoming, this life-changing event that happens at the age of 15. And then what he learned about being around the Duke program and how he's taken that into where he is today in his early 50s, making a difference in people's lives through his new book and through speaking and just, changing the narrative, which is what it says on the back of his book, is something that David is passionate about. I think you'll like getting to know David Cooks, author and speaker here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Take a listen. David Cooks, welcome to the show.
Hey, good morning, and thank you.
It's good to talk to you. We're grateful for you taking the time to come on our program today. And let's just dive right into your story, because it is a powerful one. And there's a moment when at the age of 15, your life changes forever. But before we get to that moment, take us back to your childhood and what sports meant to you. This is a sports and faith podcast, but where was sports in the childhood, I guess, of David Cooks, and what did sports mean to you as a kid?
Yeah, I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I grew up on the north side in the inner city. And like a lot of inner city kids, I loved basketball. I played it every day as much as I could. And like all kids, I was hoping to, play for as long as I can and for at the highest level that I could play. And so I started off as a young kid. I was a point guard. I had a nickname. They called me Gus Williams for those who
I remember him. I was a little young, but I do remember Gus. He was good.
Yeah, and he was a really good guy. The longer I tell the story, the better I became too. But
that's right.
It was a term of endearment, and so the game was really, really important to me, and it was just one of the things in my life that I gave everything to. Coming up as a kid, my parents always taught us about giving everything into whatever you were doing. And that meant academically, spiritually, basketball-wise, etc. And so there wasn't a day, if the weather wasn't too bad outside, that I was out on the court playing.
Was church, and you mentioned spiritually, I guess, in the way that you said your parents kind of raised you, was church and faith a part of that as well as a kid?
Yeah, it was a part of our life. Not immediately. My mom and dad both had conversion experiences with Jesus Christ when I was probably about 10 years old, I believe. And from there, I began to see the transformative power of Jesus Christ in their life and the impact it had on how they were living. And what an example it was for me as I later on in life, not much later on in life, gave my life to Christ then.
So tell me about that moment for you and where it was when that happened and how faith, for you personally, because it's one thing to have your parents' faith. It's another thing to make it your own, right? And,
absolutely.
Tell me about that. And maybe if that coincides with what happened at age 15, maybe talk about both of those, but, tell me about where your faith became sort of your own.
Yeah, I was 13 years old, believe it or not, when I got on my knees literally and asked Christ to come into my life, and I yielded my life to him. I didn't understand necessarily what that meant at the time, but I knew that I wanted to spend eternity with him. I didn't want to go to that place they were talking about called hell and stuff.
Sure.
So my parents' example really allowed for me to want to serve the God that they were serving. And the one thing my parents always told us was that God only has children; He doesn't have grandchildren. So we can't live for you. Our faith is only good for us. We can show you our God, but you have to serve Him yourself. And so when I was 13, I made that commitment. Like I said, not knowing what that meant, but I knew something had happened in my life, and I began to study the Word of God and do that kind of stuff. And then at age 15 is when I had a spinal aneurysm.
Yeah, tell us about that. Let's get right into that. I know you're a high school freshman, right? A basketball player. Life changes forever in many ways.
Yeah.
So tell us about that and what happened.
Yeah, actually, I was a sophomore in high school.
Sophomore,
okay. I went to school. It was October 19th of 1979. And I went to school that morning. We had our midterm exams, our first quarter exams, rather. And my back was bothering me a little bit, but I didn't think much of it because I just had gotten the physical a week before and was cleared. And I was ready to try out for the freshman basketball team at my high school. By the time I finished the exam, and I played a little bit that day, and I wasn't quite as flexible and athletic as I normally would be, and I wasn't a great athlete. Let's just put that out there.
Yeah.
But I struggled a little bit that day, and I went home, and in a matter of 12 to 14 hours, I was in the emergency room at St. Michael's Hospital in Milwaukee, and 5 hours later, they discovered that I had an aneurysm. I had a blood vessel that erupted on my spine. And we did some exploratory surgery, but there was nothing they could do at that point. And that's been 39 years ago this October. It really has been from that moment on, and I tell people this, not only have I had a really good life, I've actually had a great life. It's been full of challenges, but it's full of victory along the way. And you can't have victories if you don't have challenges. And so each day has been a journey, and each day has been full of at least one win a day. And that's kind of brings me to where I am in my life right now.
Let's go through a little bit of the time and, what you're going through. I mean, you're 15, right? And I have a daughter, she's 14, and just knowing that sort of mindset. I remember being 15 and a sophomore and just kind of a knucklehead kid, and, you have this experience, in many ways a tragedy in some ways, even though you're still here and it's great. But you didn't even kind of mention that, when you said there was nothing that they could do, describe what that means, because you're T6 paraplegic, I think is the proper term. But so the aneurysm comes and it I'd never heard of something like that, I guess. You hear aneurysm and most people think the brain, right? So
absolutely, what
exactly happened to your back and to the point where it caused you to not be able to walk again?
Yeah, so it is interesting. You normally hear of aneurysm in the brain and sometime in the stomach.
Yeah.
What occurred to me was there was just a blood vessel on the spinal cord itself and it ended up damaging the spinal cord when it erupted, and it left you paralyzed. And at age 15, someone was asking me actually the other day, like, how did you handle that at age 15? And as I look back at it, and I begin to do some research and read articles and stuff that were written about me back then, I had such a peace about things that I remember saying, God, you're bigger than this. I've got to give this to you to handle, because I can't take it. I mean, it's not mine. I can't handle it on my own. And the thing that really changed me was when I was in a rehabilitation center, and I began to see that there were so many people in there who were much worse off than I was, that had much less ability than I had. And I began to thank God for what I could do, and began to thank Him for what I had. And at that point, I began to understand that I really could handle this, and that God was with me, and that I was going to be okay. And to this day, I still believe that I'm going to be okay, and that I am okay. And that really, that moment of perspective really changed my life.
That's amazing, and especially being 15 and understanding, the faith aspect of it, I guess. I know you said you came to Christ at 13, but again, very young. So faith was a big part of how you were able to, I don't even know if the word is just dealing with what happened or coping with what happened, but faith was huge, I guess, I would imagine, in something, in dealing with something like that.
Absolutely. I tell people that I believe that the greatest gift God has ever given to man is the ability to believe. Because what you believe will impact how you live and how you handle whatever life throws your way. And at a very young age, I believed in the miraculous. I believed in God's ability to sustain you, and God's ability to help you to get through. That's the one thing I knew and I had seen with my own eyes, and through my dad's work sometimes at prisons and all those types of things. So it wasn't hard for me to believe. It wasn't hard for me to have hope. The scripture talks about how Abraham believed when there was no hope. Yeah. And I understand what that meant at that point. Now let's just make it perfectly clear. Walking is much better. So let's just throw that out there.
Yeah, of course.
It's a much better life. But in the meantime, because I always talk about in the meantime, because God is not finished with me yet.
That's right.
I still need to live, and I still need to excel, and your relationship with God doesn't change. What I did ask God was, in the midst of my circumstance, if you're not going to change it, change me in it, so I know how to give you glory out of it. And that's what He's done. I mean, it's been amazing to me where He's taken me in my life. It truly is a remarkable story.
We're talking to David Cooks here, author and speaker. His new book's called Getting Undressed: From Paralysis to Purpose. And he joins us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. David, what was it like just adjusting to this new life? Just going back to school, I guess, not being able to play basketball. You said that was your sport. What was it like just adjusting to this new life without being able to walk?
It was an interesting adjustment, because I didn't know any better that I was different, so to speak. I was just excited to get back to school. I was 15 years old. I was just starting to like girls, all that stuff. So that was what was on my 15-year-old mind. And then I had 4 or 5 really good friends in high school that helped me get to games, do the things I needed to do, drive me back and forth, all of those things. And it was an eclectic group of guys, unbelievers, believers, guys that had substance abuse issues. I mean, these guys became my friends, and they helped support me and help me to kind of re-enter into the school and get back on the horse, so to speak. And this book really was about thanking all the people along the way who helped me become who I am today. And along the way, it's a two-way street. People talk about that I've impacted their lives, but a lot of people have impacted my lives. And God has placed people in my life to help me, and I accepted that help to get through. And that's really how the transition was really kind of seamless. It was a smooth transition. I had to deal with the daily nuances and struggles of being in a wheelchair, of getting undressed and getting dressed again and all those types of things.
Sure.
But it was actually not too bad.
Tell us about, as your life, is changed and you grow up and you start maturing into adulthood and thinking about college and after that. Tell me about the inability to walk, how that affected your life choices. And obviously there's things that you can't do because you couldn't walk, but did that affect your life choices at all? Or was it like, I'm going to still do the things that I dream about and wanted to do?
Well, it was probably a combination of both. One of the things I talk about in the book is that obstacles don't define you, but they redirect you. And they may slow you down, but they don't keep you from getting to your destiny. Mm-hmm. And so my love for the game and my passion for basketball didn't change. What changed for me was how I was going to be a part of the game. And that's how I got involved in coaching. I did play wheelchair basketball in college and did some things with that. And I was able to pursue my goal of the game, of being involved in the game. I just had to go about it in a different way. And that's what happens when you aren't using your legs. You get dressed differently. You get in and out of the car differently. You take a shower differently. So you're doing many of the same things that everybody else does. You just have to do them a little differently. And so for me, I was just so excited when I was asked to join the Vic Tanny Warriors back in the late 80s and early 90s, which was an AAU program here in Wisconsin. And we had some of the top players in the country, Damon Key and Jim McIlvain and Silas Mills, Calvin Rayford. I mean, just some of the best to ever play here. Yeah. And they won the national championship in the summer. I was asked to help with those guys. And that was the beginning for me of an unbelievable career in coaching. And it allowed for me just to continue to be a part of what I loved. And my passion for the game never died when I lost the use of my legs. Neither did my passion for wanting to impact the lives of other people.
That's great. Now, I know in the book, when I look at the back of the book, there's there's endorsements in so many different books, right? And a lot of people saying things. But I'm just going to read this endorsement. And then when I say the name, everybody's going to know who it is. It says, David's journey from the playgrounds of Milwaukee to Cameron Indoor Stadium and beyond is captivating and provides a framework to find a new perspective and to build a life filled with passion and purpose. Getting Undressed is inspiring and proof that you can win in life regardless of the circumstances. And the person who wrote that for you, David, is Mike Krzyzewski, the head coach at Duke University. So tell me about the connection with Coach K and how you came about just forming a relationship with him.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to meet Coach K in 1991. I was at Duke University to get my master's degree in business. And, I tell the story in the book that I had opportunities to go to a number of schools, and I wanted to make sure I went to a school that had a pretty good basketball program. Well,
1991, if I'm not mistaken, they won the national championship, right?
Yes. So, I think I wasn't the smartest guy in the room, but I knew that would be a pretty good choice. So I remember there are a number of names that are familiar to people at the time. And, Jay Billis was there, and he was the grad assistant. Sure. And Tommy Amica was one of the assistant coaches along with Mike Bray, who are both head coaches now. Yeah. And I was able to connect with Tommy Amica one day. He was leaving the business school to go full-time and coach with Coach K. And I was talking to him, and I said, hey, I would love to have an opportunity just to help and serve you guys. I'm from Wisconsin. And he asked me if I had any information he could give the coach. And I had something that I could give him. And the thing that also helped trigger this was there was a player named Tony Lang. And I went into the office a couple of times to see if I could meet with Coach K. He wasn't there. I thought they were just blowing me off, but he really wasn't there. Yeah. And Tony Lang was sitting there, and he was a player. And he said, hey, aren't you the guy from Wisconsin? And I'm like, well, I think so, but I wasn't sure how you would know that. Yeah. And sure enough, in St. Petersburg, Florida, I was with that AAU program from Wisconsin, and Tony was down there, and he saw us playing. And he said to me, man, I love the way you interact with your players. Are you here to help us? And I'm like, bingo, there it is.
Yep.
So this is said right in the office in front of everybody. And eventually I got a chance to meet Coach K. He had me fill up water bottles and wash laundry to get started. The graduate assistant position was terminated after Jay Billis finished it up. And the rest has kind of been history. You know, I did a couple years there with him. And obviously that helped, was a springboard for me to do some other things. So my relationship with him is a great one. I was honored that he would be willing to support the book and to provide the testimonial that he has. A really quick story. I was just at Grant Hill's Hall of Fame induction a week ago or whenever that was. Yeah. And Tony Lang was there. And I hadn't seen Tony since I left Duke in 1993. And it was such a great time to have a reunion with him and Grant and just a great opportunity. And those are the things I talk about that, you know, I can't make up these stories and I can't make up the places that I've been, but God has really strategically put me in the places that I've been. And I'm just honored and grateful to him for doing that.
That's awesome. We're going to talk about kind of where that's taken you to now in a second, but I got to dive in a little bit on the Duke time, the time that you were there, especially if you said it was 91 when you got there and 93 when you left. Again, this is my sort of sports nerd in me. They won titles in 91 and 92, and that's the Christian Laettner years and Bobby Hurley, and you mentioned Grant Hill and Tony Lang and guys that were there, Cherokee Parks. I mean, these are guys that were really, really amazing players and in many ways, like Grant, Hall of Fame players, and Coach K, who's the Hall of Fame of all Hall of Fames, as Grant Hill called him at his Hall of Fame speech. He called him the GOAT, which I thought was really great. So tell me what you learned just being around that sort of atmosphere and culture of winning, especially that time in 91, 92, when Duke had gone to the Final Four many years, but I think that was the first time, that was their first title or titles run. So tell me about just being around the team and the culture at that time, especially compared to where they are now, obviously, in the legendary franchise and program that they have. But tell me about being around and kind of what you learned during that time.
Man, let me tell you, that was it was crazy. It was so exciting and so much fun. You're right. I mean, it was the Laettner Hurley Hill crew, and you know, the one thing that I learned a lot about preparation. I've learned a lot about standards. I learned a lot about excellence and the work that it takes to be the best, and how you can't compromise on things. That was amazing to me to watch and learn what it took. The thing that I think I gathered the most, though, especially from Coach K, was how to love people and how to love your players. The one thing that I think he has that all the greats have, but he has a special knack at it, is people skills and the ability to know how to hit each player's button. And, you know, that takes a lot of time and effort to build a personal relationship with each one of your players to the point that you can know how to motivate and how to inspire and how not to go over the edge, if you know what I mean, with them. That was, to me, so invaluable. The games themselves, are you serious? Dean Smith and Pete Gillen and all that. I mean, it was the ACC. Yeah. It was like those games were out of control. You would go there, and I had never been to Cameron, you know, and people say, well, how did you get to meet Coach? I said, you know something, I didn't have anything to lose. I didn't have anything to lose. If he said no, I'm still getting my MBA. Yeah. I'm still going to go to school.
That's right.
And I felt I had a little bit to offer. And so, man, you talk about winning at that level and not making excuses, and the amount of, I talk to guys all the time and they all want to make the league. And I'm like, well, have you put in 1,000 shots today? Mm-hmm. You know, how much time have you put in the gym today? Yeah. You just learn about that. And that to me was two of the most incredible years of my life. I wish I had taken more pictures because it's a lot easier to do that now than it was back then. But I still talk with a number of those guys, and you know, Bobby's a coach out of Arizona State, and they're still just nice to me and treat me just like I'm family. So that's what that experience was like.
Couple more questions here with David Cooks, author and speaker, and the new book again is called Getting Undressed from Paralysis to Purpose, available everywhere books are sold right now. I want to talk about just everything that transpires after Duke. You go into coaching and education and teaching as well. So you're still involved in sports for many, many years, coaching both high school basketball. I read that you were coaching some college. Tell me about sort of, I guess, the Cliff Notes version of the last 25 years since leaving Duke and what you've been able to do and be a part of.
Yeah, well, over the last 25 years after leaving Duke, I went to the Northeast. I did some corporate work for about as long as I could take it, and then I had to leave that because that wasn't where my heart was. I coached at a small school in the Northeast in Darien, Connecticut, and was in a conference that was unbelievable with Vito Montello and some of the great coaches in the Northeast. And I was able to also establish some AAU programs and be on the staff of Eastern Invitational, which is now Hoop Group, with those guys. And so I was able to coach and learn a lot. And I moved back to Wisconsin in 1999 and became the head coach at my alma mater, Marquette High School, here in 2003. And I was there as a coach for 14 years, had a lot of success. Took us to the first state tournament run that we've had since we combined the private and public schools. Ended up actually getting fired, which was I'd never been fired before. That was crazy.
Yeah.
I was an economics teacher there, and was told that we want to go in another direction. And so my question is, where are we going? Because I was going with you. Well, that wasn't what they were talking about. So, I had to learn how to reflect, regroup, and relaunch after that. And fortunately for me, I was able to join Concordia University here in Wisconsin, which is a Division III school, as an assistant coach, and continue my coaching there. Along the way after that, I was so fortunate. There's a young man, he's a dad now. His name is Guy Raincourt, and he's the head coach, I think, now at Western Connecticut. But at the time, he was at Lycoming in Pennsylvania. Guy was a young man I helped get into the business years and years ago, and he began to take college guys over to Europe, and it was called East Coast Basketball, and USA Basketball actually took them under their umbrella. And so in 2014, I was so fortunate. He said he wanted me to go with them over to Europe, and it was Frank Martin of South Carolina fame, and myself and Guy. And we took a bunch of players over to Estonia and Finland and were able to represent the United States there. That was, you talk about an experience that I will never, ever forget. And to start as a kid on the playgrounds in Milwaukee, to have what happened to me happen, to get to Duke, to be a head coach at my alma mater, get to the state tournament, go overseas, and coach college basketball again. Man, I when I said my life has been great, I mean, I've had a really good life. And that's kind of where I am now. And with the book out and all that, I'll probably take a reprieve from this upcoming season, as I've got to try to do the book tour thing and all of that, and see where it takes me now.
So tell me about why now write that book? Because you said, the purpose was to do, a lot of it was to thank the people who've made such a difference in your life. But, obviously I wrote my first book recently too, and I get that question a lot. And I often I'm just curious, why write the book right now? What was your motivating factor and kind of how it came together?
I left my teaching position a couple of years back, and I felt my assignment was up there, and I was talking to my wife about it, and she was in agreement with me. I didn't know what I was supposed to do next, but I remember telling my students, I'm going to write a book. I think that's what I'm supposed to do next. And I kind of played around with that until December of 2016, rather. I'm sorry. It was December 6, 2016. I was flying out to Boston to give a speech at the Colonnade Hotel to some banking executives. And I ended up needing oxygen on the flight there, and they took me immediately to Massachusetts General Hospital, and I had massive blood clots in my lungs. And as I stayed in that hospital, in the ER, I remember telling God, I said, I asked him to honor the life that I've lived for him and just get me back home. And as they began to treat me, I was talking to the doctors, and they were asking what I did and all that kind of stuff. And one of the doctors said to me, when are you going to write your book? And I'm like, what did he say to me? When are you going to write your book? And I'm like, I need to do that. I've been meaning to. And another doctor came and was talking to me about writing a book. And I'm like, okay, I need to get this book done now. And so I got home, I got back on my feet, finished that season as an assistant coach up at Concordia, and I started writing the book. And the book really, and let's just put this out there too. I don't like to read or write, so for me, this was more than a challenge. This was a move of faith and obedience, because I really felt there was something I was supposed to do. And I tell you what, when I finished writing this book, there was a sense of accomplishment, a sense of fulfillment that I hadn't experienced in some of the other things I've done. And I've done some great things in my life and been fortunate to do some great things. But this was special, and it's a book that is written and designed to hopefully touch people where they are and provide them with hope. We live in such a time where everybody's angry and mad at each other. I want them to know they can make it, and that there is hope, and you can overcome things, and you don't have to quit, and you don't have to stop. And that's really a lot of the message in the book. I was just speaking to some CEOs earlier this week, and some of them were concerned about, let's not talk about faith too much. And I said,
I've been there and done that.
Yeah. And I said, look, this book is my story, and faith is the foundation of my story. I categorize this book, it's not a faith-based book, but it is a book filled with faith.
Yeah.
And I think people can relate to the reality of it and the realness of it. And the title of the book, if you let me just quickly talk about that.
Yeah, of course.
Getting Undressed. Obviously, it's a catchy title, and it's the biggest thing you see on the front of the cover.
Yep.
But it was an experience that I had in the rehabilitation center when they teach you how to do a lot of things over, because you have to learn how to, get out of bed, get out of the chair, all that kind of stuff. And I was sitting there one night, and I remember that day they taught me how to get dressed, and I was in my room, and I was sitting there, and there was an emergency, and no one was there to help me get in the bed. And I was like, if I want to go home, I need to teach myself how to get undressed. And that became, for me, as I start to think about things that everybody goes through, everybody gets undressed at least once a day. And getting undressed for me represented an ending of something and the beginning of something else. What you take off represents where you've been, and what you put on is an indication of where you're going. And so we all get undressed, and it doesn't have to be such an uncomfortable thing, but it can be a new beginning. And I think the book talks about a lot of leveraging endings into beginnings, and how to take what you have and make it work.
It's really good. He is David Cooks, author of the book, again, called Getting Undressed from Paralysis to Purpose. The cover is actually a picture of a wheelchair with the clothes hanging on it and a basketball. It's really, it's definitely, from a guy who wrote a book, I can appreciate all of that, not just writing it, but like the design and what's the cover look like and what's the title going to be. And now speaking, tell people how they can get in touch with you, especially if they're interested in having you come and share your story and encouragement with others. Tell us about how we can stay in touch with you, David.
Fantastic. I have a website. It's davidcooksspeaks.com.
Okay.
You can reach me there, and all my contact information is on there as well. So davidcooksspeaks.com is the easiest way to get a hold of me.
Awesome. David, this has been great catching up with you, hearing your journey. Last question that we asked to so many of our guests here on the podcast, and I'll ask it to you. What have you been learning in this season of life where God has you now? It's been 25 years since Duke and many more years since your injury at age 15 and the paralysis and the spinal aneurism. Tell me what you're learning today in this season of life from the Lord. What's he been teaching you?
I think he's been teaching me to trust him. And in this process of writing the book and trying to get out and speak, I thought I knew who I was going to rely on to help make these things happen. Well, God has his own plan. And and so
I laugh because it's true, right?
yeah, it is so true.
Yeah.
And the one thing I have learned in this process and where I am in my life is I need to trust him. I need to keep moving forward now. I can't sit and not try to do things, but allow for him to make my way clear and make my path clear. And that has not been, sometimes that's troubling because the phone isn't ringing and people aren't calling and the people you thought would be in your corner aren't there. But God says he will never leave you or forsake you, and that you're his workmanship and he's created works for you to do before the foundation of the earth. And I'm so excited that I'm walking in them right now. And that's what he's teaching me, is just to trust him and that he's got this, because the success of my life and the success of this book is in his hand, is not in mine. And that's what I'm learning right now.
DavidCooksSpeaks.com is the website. The book is Getting Undressed from Paralysis to Purpose. Go get yourself a copy of it. And listen, just been great to get to know you, David. Thanks for sharing your journey, your story with us on the podcast. And we'll hopefully catch up with you again sometime soon. Best wishes.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
It was great to have David Cooks, author of the book Getting Undressed from Paralysis to Purpose, joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Inspirational story, and one that I think can help a lot of people. David's a great guy. We probably spent 15 minutes once we hit stop on the recording button here, just talking some more and just kind of walking through each other's journeys and encouraging each other. So really like getting to know David. Can't recommend his book enough. It's called Getting Undressed from Paralysis to Purpose. And it's at the bottom of the book. I like what it says. It says, your ability to endure is always greater than your willingness to endure. And so check that out. That's David Cooks. And his book, his website, I should mention, is davidcooksspeaks.com. davidcooksspeaks.com. Check it out. Getting Undressed from Paralysis to Purpose is the name of the book. Thanks to David for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. We also thank you for listening. Take a screenshot of this podcast if you enjoyed it. Share it on your social media pages. Let people know, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, maybe even your YouTube channel or Snapchat, whatever you're using. Take a screenshot and let people know about the intersection of sports and faith and the stories found here at Sports Spectrum. We also want to thank our sponsors, Compassion International. Go to compassion.com/sports spectrum. It's $38 a month, and your sponsorship provides access to school, medical care, food, vocational training, and the opportunity to know Jesus. I mean, just a powerful, powerful opportunity here for you to make a difference in a child's life. Not just making a difference, making an eternal impact on a child's life. That's what's happening with over 1.8 million children around the world as a part of Compassion International. Go to compassion.com. Listen, again, $38 a month. You sponsor a child and make a difference. It's the best $38 you'll spend every single month. Compassion.com/sports spectrum. Sponsor a child today. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. Remember, all of our content can be found at sportspectrum.com. Check it out. Daily devotionals there, including this podcast, as well as all sorts of articles on the intersection of sports and faith, and your chance to subscribe to our Sports Spectrum magazine at an unbelievable rate right now, just $18. Go to sportspectrum.com, get our magazine, and check out all the stories on the intersection of sports and faith. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time right here on the Sports Spectrum podcast.